In a refrain for which now, 30 years on, it's most remembered, Dominique Janicot, at the conclusion to his 1991 essay, The Theological Turn of French Phenomenology, declares frankly his polemic's central thesis, quote, "Phenomenology and theology make two," end quote. Upon its publication, his pamphlet or report leveled criticisms against the current state of phenomenology in France, putting on trial a second generation of new phenomenologists who, according to him, by introducing a biblical God not belonging there, were thereby corrupting philosophy's future. Criticizing what it characterizes as the impossible attempt to surmount the insurmountable difference between phenomenology and theology, Janicot's essay's sole goal in doing so, as it says, is to offer a methodological clarification of phenomenology. And as they say, the rest is history. Janicot's essay went on to trigger a debate whose reverberations continue to be felt today, not just in France, but elsewhere too. The text's ardent language testifies to how urgent Janicot himself took the stakes to be at the time of its writing. He records the philosophical scene in Paris as follows. In the wake of a swerve initiated with Emmanuel Levinas's 1961 publication of Totality and Infinity, there's emerged a theological turn involving a series of further veerings, epitomized by the work of Paul Ricoeur, Jean-Luc Marion, Michel Henry, and Jean-Louis Chrétien, all of whom, in their own ways, stand guilty of strict treason against the phenomenological reduction. The treason, he charges, quote, involves the intrusion of nothing less than the God of the biblical tradition, end quote. A subversion that's taken hostage phenomenology by, quote, a theology that does not want to say its name, end quote. Without wanting to object to the theological as such, but rather its intrusion into the phenomenological field, Janicot aims to expose what he sees as a strategic blurring between the phenomenological and theological. For their philosophical genealogy and Husserl notwithstanding, these deviations from phenomenological method lack methodological legitimacy. Abandoning the Husserlian norm of evidence and instead substituting metaphysical aplomb for phenomenological neutrality, they indulge in a hyperbolic discourse whose rhetoric transgresses the rational and intuitable. Courting antinomy, the result is nonsense. Consequently, in the report's final chapter, Reorientation, Janicot suggests the works of Levinas, Ricoeur, Marion, Henry, and Chrétien have fulfilled the foreboding prophecy with which Gilbert Ryle had concluded his 1927 review of Being and Time. Ryle had said, quote, "It's my personal opinion that, qua first philosophy, phenomenology is at present heading for bankruptcy and disaster and will end either in self-ruinous subjectivism or windy mysticism," end quote. From a vantage point able to survey the intervening decades, Ryle's worry, Janicot claims, has proved correct. In what amounts to a spiritualist's last stand, this theological turn has pursued apologetics. Despite draping itself in the garb of the canonical terms for which the phenomenological tradition is known, what we have instead, says Janicot, is not rigor, but ideology. Thus, he so concludes, the Nouvelle Phenomenologie is a phenomenology in name only. Before turning to the details of this debate between Janicot and those he criticizes, I should note in passing that there's no disputing that Janicot's essay, in a certain respect, failed to achieve its intent. Rather than putting a stop to the work it criticized, Janicot actually only increased interest in it. Jean-Louis Chrétien once told me that he and the others whom Janicot had targeted had not at the time seen themselves as working together under a banner. But by being labeled together in the way they were by Janicot, it brought more attention to their respective authorships and actually strengthened their efforts. Chrétien found this amusing, a sort of sign that God indeed works in mysterious ways. The line of criticism inaugurated by Janicot and taken up by others too, as we shall see, calls to mind a question. Assuming for argument's sake that the work being done under the banner of what Jean-Nicot terms the theological turn is not phenomenology, but something else, in what does its failure consist? If, as Jean-Nicot says, the work of those whom he associates with the turn is not phenomenological, what is the phenomenological? Reading the essay, immediately one sees that Jean-Nicot himself struggles with this question, with the fact that it's less difficult to say what phenomenology isn't than to say what it is. He often resorts to a kind of apophatic approach when offering his criticisms. Far easier, so it seems, to identify when a thought claiming to be phenomenological fails to be so, than to define precisely the necessary and sufficient conditions, what they are for the phenomenological method. Taking Levinas as his exemplar of a merely apparent phenomenological philosophy, Jean-Nicot does, however, positively identify two features said to explain the sense in which Levinas's thought falls short of the real thing. First, as he notes, quote, "The essence of intentionality is to be sought by the phenomenological reduction in phenomenal immanence," end quote. By introducing a transcendence where it doesn't belong, Levinas abandons the phenomenological field of immanence for a transcendent beyond. Second, and relatedly, the introduction of this beyond leads to nonsense, for the experiential facts it purports to uncover, but which resist eidetic insight, thereby remain obscure and unclear. Jean-Nicot reminds his readers of the Husserlian method that this Levinasian flight into transcendence is said to flout. Quote, "What goes together with this method is its end, eidetic elucidation, the intuition of essences," end quote. So according to Jean-Nicot then, to totality and infinity's analyses regarding the face lack any fulfilling intuition. From an orthodox Husserlian perspective, insofar as they're not eidetic, they're not properly phenomenological. The same is true of other central Levinasian concepts as well. Spurning the Husserlian demand for the evidence of eidetic insight, Levinas's pronouncements regarding desire, eros, and the other are unclear and indistinct. At times, Jean-Nicot will not stop short of saying that they lack sense entirely. For although they may seem at a surface level to be saying something genuinely philosophical, the closer one looks, this turns out not to be the case. He says, quote, "These words signify nothing," he says bluntly at one point. Rather than offering us insightful evidence by which these terms confirm their meaning, we find terms fraught with contradiction or muddled nonsense, windy mysticism, just as Ryle had predicted. Not only then does Levinas not justify the claims he makes with attestable insight, very often, suggests Jean-Nicot, their indeterminateness is so severe that it remains unclear how they're even to be understood at all. So according to Jean-Nicot, Levinas's ethics as first philosophy fails to live up to the phenomenological standards of intuition and evidence. In totality and infinity, Levinas holds that meaning, what can be experienced both first personally and intelligibly, overflows the horizons of intentionality, as understood by Husserl. In fact, perhaps the key takeaway from Levinas's analyses regarding the face is the idea that it accomplishes a, quote, counter-intentionality. Levinas, in effect, argues that what enables a meaningful encounter with entities as entities is not due to the capacities of a transcendental ego or an I. Rather, it's the I that is itself constituted by the encounter with the other. As Jean-Luc Marion will put this point himself, quote, "Far from being able to constitute this phenomenon, the I experiences itself as constituted by it," end quote. Levinas has reversed things, locating the origin of meaning outside the subject and thus beyond the horizons of intentionality. Jean-Nicot recognizes this move Levinas attempts, but he rejects it for, in Janicot's view, it twists the problem of intentionality to the point of incoherence. As he says, quote, "We will be told that the phenomenological reduction has been replaced by revelation. In short, we'll have to listen again to the refrain of the beyond. But this is always to put off the same question. Why keep playing along at phenomenology when the game is fixed? Why claim to overcome intentionality only to reintroduce an intention of sense or an intentionality of transcendence?" End quote. For Janicot, the very notion of a counter-intentionality is tantamount to nonsense. Quote, "Levinas's conception of intentionality leads us to question the very coherence of his thought." End quote. In reputing to explicate a realm of meaning beyond what is constituted intentionally, a realm of sense accordingly no longer accessible to eidetic intuition, Levinas has found himself in nonsense, says Janicot. Violating what is said to lie within the limits of intentionality, the face contravenes the very conditions of what makes sense meaningful. It violates the norm of intuitive evidence. Just as intentionality for Janicot is the bedrock, explaining how we experience entities, so anything said to be given by first violating the conditions for intentionality deteriorates into speculative and hence unconfirmable nonsense. Janicot's is thus in a way a Kantian position, one insisting on the principle that certain necessary conditions determine what can be encountered. Anything not conforming to such conditions simply does not appear. It's this Kantian understanding of intentionality that Marion's own account of the saturated phenomenon seeks to challenge by widening the scope of Levinas's original contention regarding the face. Marion, in an emblematic passage from Reduction and Givenness, says this, quote, "What would occur phenomenologically if a phenomenon did not agree with or correspond to the eye's power of knowing? The Kantian answer leaves hardly any doubt. The phenomenon quite simply would not appear. Or better, there would not be any phenomenon at all, but an objectless perceptive aberration. If this answer remains meaningful for a poor or common law phenomenon, does it still hold for a saturated phenomenon?" End quote. According to Marion, the transcendental phenomenology of Husserl and Janicot is only able to accommodate a partial area of the total phenomenal field. What it identifies as the field of meaning opened by the horizons of intentionality does not delimit the bounds of what can be meaningfully given. Rather, it only accentuates particular regional domains of givenness, what Marion in Reduction and Givenness calls the object or the entity, or poor and common phenomenon. As for a phenomenon that would appear despite first violating the conditions of ordinary intentionality, Marion terms such a phenomenon a saturated phenomenon, which is fourfold: the event, the idol, the icon, which is his term for what Levinas called the face, and the flesh, which is Michel Henry's term for our experience of our own bodies. As Marion says, quote, "Reducing givenness means freeing it from the limits of every other authority, including those of intuition." End quote. Works as Marion's Reduction and Givenness and Being Given are thus to be understood within the context of the question of appearing. He insists their attempts at explicating the limits of intentionality and what in turn appears beyond them. This leads to the second feature Janicot claims characterizes pseudo-phenomenological thought. Janicot says that Levinas schematizes experience in a way that neglects its subtle contours. By blanketing experience with an overarching framework that does not fit it, Levinas's thought abandons the phenomenological injunction to describe what appears as it appears. So at least is Janicot's claim. This over-schematization of experience is evident, Janicot contends, in Marion's work also. Now, The charge of over-schematization turns squarely on its understanding of the phenomenological reduction in Husserl and Heidegger. The alleged problem with Marion's so-called third reduction, the reduction to givenness, is that it depends on what Janicot argues is Marion's unconvincing account of what Marion means by metaphysics. Janicot says, quote, "What is questionable from the methodological point of view is the status of phenomenology and of the phenomenological between a metaphysics that's been overcome or challenged and a theology that's been made possible, at once prepared and held in reserve," end quote. More specifically, the dispute between Janicot and Marion concerns the legitimacy of Marion's claim that the phenomenological reduction undergoes three iterations. First, transcendental in Husserl; second, existential or ontological in Heidegger; and third, the, quote, "pure form of the call" in Marion. By challenging Marion's reading of metaphysics, Janicot aims to block Marion's resulting tripartite classification of the reduction. He says, quote, "If the relation between phenomenology and metaphysics is more open and complex than Marion's presentation of the problem would have us believe, by the same stroke, the linearity he projects onto the Heideggerian radicalization of the reduction must be called into question," end quote. Or again, quote, "The passage from the second to the third reduction was as if hooked onto the model of the passage from the first to the second. But the trajectory of this first passage, given as a model for the second, seemed to us much too complex to be formalized as Marion did, thus imperiling the whole operation," end quote. The dispute between Janicot and Marion over metaphysics and the phenomenological reduction can be initially assessed in light of Husserl. The matter turns on how precisely to understand two famous stretches of text from Husserl's corpus, both from his 1913 Ideas 1. Invoking the principle of principles in section 24, Marion, for his part, claims that his reduction to givenness frees the phenomenon, disclosing previously unappreciated modes of appearing. Marion contends that his third reduction to the pure form of the call achieves phenomenology's most fundamental aspiration, by no longer confining phenomenality to the limits imposed on appearing, even by Husserl. In response, invoking section 58 of Ideas 1, Janicot contends that Marion surreptitiously paves the way for an introduction of a God who should instead be bracketed from the field of phenomenological immanence. For Janicot, the reduction to givenness is not a development of phenomenology's method, but rather a theological intrusion. Faced with these competing interpretations of the role of God vis-a-vis the reduction, we might well ask, what's the status of theology after the reduction? Or better still, what's the status of God in phenomenology? Here I think Jean-Yves Lacasse's The Appearing of God is very important to consider. In the work's third chapter, Appearance Without Reduction, Lacasse subverts the distinction between the natural and phenomenological attitudes. The natural attitude being our ordinary way of encountering the world, the phenomenological attitude being our way of bracketing the world. Natural life is our ordinary experience. Phenomenological life is a radical departure from it after we've initiated the epoché and the reductions. This is Husserl's view in Ideas 1. But this distinction isn't as fixed as Husserl himself makes it out to be, Lacasse will claim. According to Husserl, to be a philosopher, as Lacasse says, quote, is to let things appear as they are, to describe them as they are. And that means breaking with natural life, natural perception, and all the rest, end quote. But Lacasse himself has doubts about this purported discontinuity between the natural and phenomenological, and for at least two reasons. He says, quote, some phenomena cannot be described without acknowledging before or during discussion that they're not accessible to reduction, and these are probably the most interesting phenomena. And are there not some phenomena, too, which we deal with spontaneously, without caring whether the thing has real existence or not? End quote. Taking this second class of phenomena first, Lacoste begins by noting how some things in everyday life show up in a way involving no commitment to their existence. Even when still in what Husserl would call the natural attitude, well before willfully enacting the epoché or the reduction, the thing's real existence is irrelevant to the experience of it. Its mode of being has been neutralized. Quote, "We will propose that even at the heart of the natural attitude, a certain reduction is already at work," end quote, Lacoste says. As an example, Lacoste has us consider certain kinds of aesthetic experience, the painting and the prelude being his own examples. When listening to Bach, as he notes, I'm not concerned with the fact that I'm listening to Bach, but simply with what I hear. Listening to Bach in ordinary experience is an experience more akin to what Husserl himself would classify as an experience belonging to the phenomenological attitude than the natural attitude. I'm entirely immersed in the essence of what appears, not the fact of its appearing, much less the fact that what appears exists. Quote, "We propose the name spontaneous reduction, then, to refer to the general disinterest in existence characterizing everyday life," end quote. In many cases, this spontaneous reduction is already at work in natural life, claims Lacoste. He accordingly observes that, quote, "We'll hunt in vain for a point of discontinuity between spontaneous and methodical reduction. It's not so much discontinuity as radicalization. The phenomenological attitude radicalizes the natural attitude," end quote. What's needed thus is a demythalization of the reduction. For as he says, quote, "The myth of reduction is that it initiates a new way of being human, a new way of dealing with things. That myth deserves to be scattered to the winds," end quote. Having noted phenomena that are encountered in natural life already under a reduction, Lacoste turns to the second class of phenomena he identifies. According to him, these phenomena show that it's not so obvious that everything without exception can be bracketed without thereby distorting their appearance. So just as some phenomena are already reduced in natural experience, so others resist a reduction entirely. Call these irreducible phenomena. Quote, "Are there phenomena that are resistant to reduction? Phenomena that simply lose their meaning when they're subjected to it," end quote. Here, it's the other person that comes to mind as an instance. If I suspend the commitment to the other's existence and try to describe his resulting mode of appearing, have I not essentially distorted what I'm trying to describe? In the case of the other, reducing the phenomenon destroys it. Quote, "Phenomenology cannot be faithful to its project without recognizing the irreducible," end quote. He notes, because sometimes bracketing a thing's existence would mean our description will be wrong. Call such things, like the other, for example, irreducible phenomena. In turn, Lacoste proposes that one might observe this of God. Quote, "Can we speak truthfully about God while suspending the question of his existence?" End quote. Bracketing God's existence while simultaneously trying to describe whatever remains does not give access to what appears, but rather distorts it. Hence, there are what Lacoste calls irreducible phenomena, the acknowledgement of which serves to highlight how separating the natural attitude and phenomenological attitude is not so easy. As he says, Husserl's distinction probably is untenable. With this demythalization of the reduction, phenomenology no longer maintains a fundamental rupture between the natural and phenomenological attitudes. If so, what Janicot took to be a firm Husserlian foundation for bracketing God is not so sturdy. Janicot, it would seem, is incorrect in concluding that section 58 of Ideas 1 justifies the exclusion of the question of God from phenomenology. Bracketing God's transcendence, one might think, is simply to distort God's mode of appearing, something we must avoid if we're to describe the phenomenon accurately. Lacoste's spontaneous reduction and irreducible phenomena shed interesting light on the methodological question concerning the relation between phenomenology and theology. For if the division between natural and phenomenological attitudes is in fact an unstable one, it certainly opens the door to God. At the same time, it may call into question the way someone like Marion for many years has tried to maintain a distinction between his phenomenology of givenness and theology. In works as Reduction and Givenness, Being Given, In Excess, and The Visible and the Revealed, Marion goes to significant lengths to caution how, in his view, he's not at all doing theology. He insists he's interested in sketching the limits of phenomenality and what accordingly can be given. Now, unquestionably, that's a purely phenomenological undertaking, if there were one. But perhaps his concern to differentiate between his phenomenological and theological works so starkly is misplaced. For in trying to do so, Marion ultimately employs a distinction itself depending on the distinction between the natural and phenomenological attitudes, which Lacoste, as we've seen, undermines. According to Marion, where phenomenology treats the saturated phenomena, including the phenomenon of revelation, as possibilities without ever thereby positing their actuality, theology makes an existence commitment. As Marion will say in Being Given, quote, "The phenomenon of revelation remains a mere possibility. I'm going to describe it without presupposing its actuality, and yet all the while propose a precise figure for it," end quote. But again, this deployment of possibility turns on the distinction between the natural and phenomenological attitudes. To blur the lines between natural and phenomenological life successfully, as Lacoste has done, is to show that the reduction is unable to impose an artificial schema on experience. So interposing Lacoste between Janicot and Marion accordingly leaves neither of the latter two unmodified. It turns out that Janicot's original charge, according to which Marion schematizes experience like Levinas, is perhaps true after all, but not for the reason Janicot had originally claimed. Just as any interface between natural and phenomenological attitudes is more fluid than Janicot or Marion allows, so then the methodological relation between phenomenology and theology is also. A distinction between the two, drawn in terms of possibility, is no longer tenable. Although then, Janicot might be correct to observe that Marion blurs phenomenology and theology more than Marion himself concedes, this is actually fine, for the very notion that the two should or can be kept apart in the way Marion and Janicot both assume they should be is questionable, relying as it does on a mythologized view of the reduction. In short, the heart of Janicot's objection to Marion's phenomenology was its schematization of the reduction. But Janicot's own notion of a radical divide between the phenomenological and natural attitudes is itself an over-schematization of experience. Even though the claim that there exists a stable distinction between phenomenology and theology is ungrounded, that's not stopped Marion's critics from proceeding as if they've shown that it is. There are moments in his own text, for instance, where Janicot himself admits to wielding the distinction between phenomenology and theology without having sufficiently clarified the two terms. At the beginning of the essay's final section, Phenomenology and Theology Make Two, he admits that his polemic has not done much to clarify the matter. Quote, "In delimiting the theological turn of French phenomenology historically, then critically, we've wanted to effect a precise methodological work. We've not at all wanted to pass it off for what it's not, a synoptic and systematic study of the relation between phenomenology and theology. But in virtue of this limitation, our reticence might be interpreted unfavorably in regard to theology itself. Is the hermeneutic indetermination in which we leave it the mask of scorn? Does ruling the question of God out of phenomenological legitimacy lead us, in fact, to the restoration of atheist phenomenology in the manner of Sartre? End quote. Without denying the relation between phenomenology and theology requires further clarification, Jean-Nicot still declares the triumph of methodological atheism. The question of God, he thinks, is ruled out. And yet, there's a qualification necessary to note in the passage just mentioned. For Jean-Nicot cautions against the mistake of understanding such atheism in the way Sartre does. How then is this atheism to be understood? If employing Husserl's distinction between the natural and phenomenological attitudes fails to ground the kind of methodological atheism Jean-Nicot wishes to formulate, it's most natural to look instead to Heidegger for the conceptual resources with which one might do so. As it happens, Jean-Nicot himself mentions by name, if only in passing, the specific Heideggerian text I have in mind. Jean-Nicot says, quote, "In this regard, perhaps not enough attention has been lent on either the phenomenological or theological side to the interest of a text little known in France, Phenomenology and Theology, a lecture given by Heidegger in 1927, but published in 1970, end quote. As Jean-Nicot mentions, on March 9th, 1927, Heidegger delivered the essay in question, which, in keeping with that same year's being and time, conceives philosophy as a science. But as that lecture notes, philosophy is not a science like others. There are ontic sciences, notes Heidegger, sciences responsible for investigating a given region of entities. In his favorite terminology of the time, these are positive sciences. Philosophy, for its own part, is a science too, yet it remains quite different. Rather than investigating beings, it's the science of being. Quote, "It's evident from the idea of science as such, insofar as it's understood as a possibility of Dasein, that there are two basic possibilities of science: sciences of beings, of whatever is, or ontic sciences, and the science of being, the ontological science, philosophy." End quote. Theology and philosophy are thus both sciences, says Heidegger. They differ in kind, however, for whereas theology is a positive science, the science of God, as it were, philosophy is the science of no entity, no thing, nothing, but simply being as such. Philosophy now is methodologically atheist, for as an inquiry into the meaning of being, it doesn't occupy itself with any region of beings or any particular being, including even God himself. Philosophy doesn't deny God's existence, it's just that God is orthogonal to the business of philosophy as Heidegger understands it. Now, does Heidegger's prohibition on God entering philosophy work? There are reasons for thinking it doesn't. I'll mention at least two. First, to place philosophy within the horizons of scientificity is to ignore that, going back to Socrates, philosophy was never primarily a quest for scientific knowledge. Rather, it was a task concerning how to live the good life, what someone like Kierkegaard would call subjective knowledge, not objective knowledge. As many of the ancients well understood, and this is something Pierre Hadot has made famous, philosophy is a way of life. And that means it involves, arguably, precisely what Heidegger, in the name of scientificity, wanted to eliminate from it. In addition to this first reason, I may cite a second one. There's an instability in the concept of philosophy, as Heidegger understands it. Heidegger insists that philosophy is methodologically atheistic, insofar as it neither decides for nor against God's existence. The atheism is purely methodological, so he says. But here I think it must be admitted that he's talking out of both sides of his mouth. For Heidegger's image of Dasein is hardly neutral. that there's a more virulent atheism at work in his conception of philosophy becomes apparent if we consider what exactly is supposed to uniquely distinguish philosophical thinking. If for Heidegger, philosophy is the, quote, free questioning of purely self-reliant Dasein, end quote, this characterization of human existence is itself contestable from the perspective of faith. Now, to be sure, Heidegger claims faith cannot seriously enter into philosophical questioning because the one who lives by faith takes oneself already to have an answer to the question, why something rather than nothing? Hence, whoever's interpreted life through the prism of faith cannot face up to the anxiety of existence. This is Heidegger's view. But that very anxiety, as Heidegger states repeatedly in Being and Time, is said to be the consequence of Dasein's fundamentally unsettled mode of being in the world. This conceals within itself more than it admits, I think. To say Dasein is fundamentally anxious is another way of saying that there's no ultimate answer to the question of who we are. Or, said otherwise, it's to say that there's no human nature. But to say that is not at all to bracket the question of God, but to reject directly the idea that we're made in the image of God. So it turns out that there's nothing neutral about Heidegger's decision, which is why it's of no small significance to stress that it is a decision. The supposed methodological atheism of Heidegger's phenomenological ontology is not so metaphysically innocuous as Heidegger himself makes it out to be. As it emerges in the context of the analysis of anxiety, Being and Time's existential analytic takes a stance decidedly against God. By portraying anxiety as the fundamental mood of human experience, it may do so only because, having interpreted that existence as perpetually enigmatic, it thereby rejects the Christian view of ourselves as beings before God. I think it's fair to suspect that, contrary to whatever Heidegger himself may say, for Heidegger, the existential analytic's explicit rejection of man as made in the imago Dei drives the methodological aspirations for a philosophy as a science of being, not the other way around. This observation leads to a further remark concerning the reputed autonomy of philosophical inquiry presently at issue. What Heidegger praises as philosophy's self-reliance, as its capacity to question for questioning's sake, takes such questioning to be sensible because it assumes there are no answers that would in turn make such questioning otiose. But once again, as before, when Heidegger rejects the imago Dei, that is to take a metaphysical stand, since it's to commit oneself, however tacitly, to a view of man's relation to reality. Man's thought to be without essence, without end, and without any measure except the one he gives to himself as the result of wrestling with the enigma of his existence by questioning. Such a view, again, is not so metaphysically innocent. It rests on a commitment which, if mistaken, leads whoever follows it badly astray. So we can agree with Heidegger that it would be a mistake to short-circuit questioning where questioning is still necessary. That's what happens when, presuming ourselves to possess answers to questions we don't, we call inquiry into a premature close. But to claim questioning must be kept ever open is effectively to commit oneself to the idea that there are no answers. And it's easy to see the danger. If there are answers, it would be a terrible mistake to go on questioning as if there aren't or couldn't be. For Heidegger, the idea that there's no ultimate answer to the meaning of human existence takes on the status of something like a dogma. Faith is the enemy of philosophy, he claims, after all, precisely because it's said to misdirect us from interrogating the insoluble enigma of being Dasein, lulling us instead into a false security, by which we come to believe naively that we have answers to questions we don't. But it has to be emphasized that things can be seen differently. According to this other way of seeing things, there's actually two ways in which one might ask amiss. as his 1927 essay on Phenomenology and Theology attests, one might do this either because we cease questioning authentically when we should have continued on with questioning. That's what concerns Heidegger. But also potentially because we may continue in questioning when there's no longer any need to continue questioning, a possibility he seems to ignore. Heidegger's attempt to establish the claim that philosophy and theology make too, I think, formulates a methodological atheism that in fact is not that at all. It's a specious methodological atheism because it's really a substantive atheism, even if Heidegger won't admit it. There is, of course, another way of coordinating the relation between philosophy and theology I think worth mentioning here. It's one itself disagreeing with Heidegger's own particular way of separating them, but it agrees with Heidegger that the two should be separated. Here we have in mind the various Aristotelian theologies, including those most notably of Thomism. For this tradition, it's true that theology deals with God in a way philosophy doesn't, but it's not the case that philosophy sets God aside completely. For philosophy, there are the rational deductions of God's existence. So distinctions between faith and reason, the supernatural and the natural, are taken to determine the methodological difference between theology's and philosophy's contents. There is natural reason, which reveals to us its truths, for example, that God exists, or perhaps the basic divine attributes. But to know more, we'll need something further beyond natural reason to reveal it to us. It's here that theology comes in, relying as it does on a divine donation beyond what we otherwise would see or understand. And usually it's here also that the further distinction between grace and nature comes into play. To summarize our discussion to this point, Jean-Nicot insists that those he criticizes have imported theology into phenomenology. For Jean-Nicot, phenomenology is to remain methodologically atheist. Marion accepts that there is a distinction between phenomenology and theology, but he maintains that what he's doing in the name of phenomenology remains legitimate because what theology posits as actual, his phenomenology treats purely as possible. Lacoste, for his own part, goes further than Marion by calling into question the very idea that there is any genuine methodological basis for distinguishing phenomenology from theology. And Michel Henry, who I've not mentioned in any detail, takes a similarly radical approach as Lacoste, since for him, the self is always already called by Christ. For Henry, God is inseparable from the question of the self. One younger thinker who Jean-Nicot did not discuss at the time in 1991, Emmanuel Falk, has gone on to show that phenomenology and theology are deeply complementary in works such as Crossing the Rubicon. There are others one could mention here as well, such as Remy Brague or Jérôme de Grammont, but because I'm framing this debate in terms of the problem of intentionality and phenomenological method, we're not able to discuss them here. In any case, the upshot is that even if one does wish to preserve some kind of firm methodological distinction between theology and phenomenology, as both Marion and Falk do, there's little reason for thinking that the two disciplines are antagonistic. That's something even Jean-Nicot himself seems to concede.